Everyone thinks Viking shelters were just rustic huts buried under snowdrifts, but the truth hides under a deeper layer of silence and earth. In 2023, during an Arctic storm that would have frozen the breath of any traveler, a team of archaeologists in Iceland recorded something that completely defied modern logic. 3 meters below the surface, inside a system of semi-buried tunnels and chambers that had been hidden for more than 1,000 years, the temperature held steady at 9.7 degrees. No fire burning, no industrial insulation, just the thermal patience of the Earth itself. That seemingly small discovery became a crack leading into a world we never imagined. A world where winter wasn't fought with force, but with understanding. Where every stone and every layer of turf formed a thermal machine that breathed slowly beneath the fjords. What's surprising isn't that the Vikings managed to survive in a climate capable of killing in hours, but that they anticipated, without equations or blueprints, what we now call passive architecture. That quiet balance between the cold pressing in from outside and the heat rising from the ground wasn't intuition. It was knowledge built through generations of observation. And if this first crack intrigues you, if you want to discover how a people without writing could build shelters capable of defying the most brutal winter on the planet, stay close and follow along. What comes next isn't history. It's a map to knowledge the Earth still remembers.
Before the storm hits.
For the Vikings, winter wasn't a passing season. It was an enemy that descended from the north like an endless shadow, a cold so dense it could split wood, freeze skin, and turn every sunrise into a calculation of pure survival. And yet, in the middle of that hostile world, they discovered something that would change their fate: the heat of the Earth itself. 3 meters beneath the surface, where light can't reach and the wind loses its voice, the temperature stays around 10 degrees, even when the air outside drops to 20, a natural refuge that doesn't distinguish cultures or continents. While the Mandan and the Inupiat were digging their lodges on the frozen plains of the Americas, the Vikings, without knowing them, were doing the same in Iceland, Norway, and Greenland, guided by the same ancestral intuition. The Earth doesn't just support, it protects. That principle, which modern science calls thermal mass, was a silent revelation for them. They understood they didn't need to fight the cold, but descend toward a warmth that had always existed beneath their feet. And if this idea seems simple to you, wait until you see how they transformed that invisible truth into architecture. How they created shelters that didn't defeat winter with force, but with the purest physics engraved in the memory of the ground. In the excavated remains at Borg, Norway, archaeologists found something that at first looked like just another variation of Viking semi-buried houses. But the more they analyzed its interwoven turf walls and grass-covered roofs, the more obvious a truth became. One that still unsettles modern engineers today. Those dwellings weren't huts. They were complete thermal systems, heat machines built from living earth. Beneath the ground, the central fire slowly warmed the lower layers, while cold air filtered in through tiny side tunnels that ran almost invisibly along the foundations. The smoke, far from getting trapped in the ceiling, followed a controlled circuit that kept the interior dry and breathable. And here comes the twist that baffled the team in 2023. When they digitally modeled the airflow inside these 9th century structures, they discovered that the thermal efficiency surpassed, in several scenarios, that of many modern rural homes in Northern Europe, even those with electric heating. What we call advanced technology was, in certain cases, less stable, less sustainable, and less resilient than a house made of grass, stone, and moss. The secret wasn't in the materials, it was in understanding the climate. The Vikings designed their shelters as thermal traps, where every stone deflected the wind, every layer of turf stored energy, and every tunnel guided the air as if the house itself were breathing. And while you think about that contrast, a people without blueprints creating structures that still challenge modern logic, maybe it's worth asking yourself something many archaeologists struggled to admit. Are we really more advanced, or did we simply forget how to listen to the earth? If you've got your own thoughts on that mystery, drop them in the comments. Sometimes the most interesting answers are born right there, where history meets doubt. Inside a Viking shelter, silence had an almost physical weight. The firelight shimmered across the turf walls as if the heat itself were breathing, and yet the most surprising thing wasn't the warmth. It was the total absence of smoke in a space with no chimney. For years, archaeologists believed that was impossible, until in 2022, at the Borg Museum, they found the marks of an underground channel barely 30 centimeters wide running parallel to the main floor. A tunnel so discreet it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who didn't understand the science behind its existence. The cold, denser air descended through that passage, warmed as it brushed against the volcanic stones of the central hearth, and rose again, creating a constant flow that fed the flame without choking it. A natural convection system so precise that, when recreated in modern tests, it produced patterns identical to contemporary passive ventilation. And the truly baffling part came later. When comparing shelters from Greenland with those from Iceland, researchers discovered different solutions that matched exactly the dominant wind direction in each region, as if every house had been tuned to its own fjord. Nothing was accidental. Air had to move like a river, not like a blow. And the Vikings had learned this by watching how the wind curled around rocks, how smoke searched for its narrowest escape, how every current depended on another. 1,000 kilometers away, the indigenous peoples of the Americas were using the same principle without ever knowing each other. Two worlds, one invisible equation. As archaeologists reconstruct the semi-buried shelters of the North Atlantic, a coincidence emerges that doesn't feel like chance, but like an echo shared between worlds that never knew each other. At the same time, the Vikings were digging ventilation tunnels beneath the turf of Iceland or the snowy slopes of Norway, the indigenous peoples of the American plains were building their pit houses and earth lodges following an almost identical principle. An equilibrium between fire, air, and soil that today we'd call bioclimatic, but that back then was simply survival. On both continents, the fire burned at the center like a small domestic sun. The smoke rose through a narrow opening in the roof, and fresh air entered at ground level, guided by low tunnels that prevented freezing winds from striking the people gathered around it. What's fascinating is that this design wasn't inherited or transmitted through cultural contact, because none existed, but discovered through pure observation, as if both civilizations had read the same invisible page of the earth. Modern simulations show that both structures retained between 70 and 80% more heat than a surface-level cabin exposed to the wind. A performance that contradicts the idea that primitive was synonymous with inefficient. And maybe that's where the biggest revelation hides. Extreme cold forces people to think the same way, even oceans apart. In recent excavations in Olar, Iceland, researchers found something that at first looked like a simple technical detail. Fragments of charred wooden ducts aligned beneath the walls of a 10th century dwelling, fragile pieces that barely survived more than 1,000 years and yet revealed a design so specific it seemed dictated by a silent intelligence. The pattern of charring showed that those channels guided air from the outside directly toward the central fire without allowing the flame to consume the oxygen in the main room. A natural, forced draft system that modern engineering wouldn't replicate until a millennium later. But what baffled the team wasn't just the channels. It was the precision with which they matched the ruins in Greenland, where side passages oriented to the south softened the Arctic wind, as if the house itself were listening to the breath of the fjord. And the more the findings were compared to those from North America, the more unsettling the coincidence became. The Salish and the Sahaptin used a small stone wall, a deflector, to direct cold air without striking the people gathered around the fire, exactly the same principle the Vikings had perfected thousands of kilometers away. It was as if both cultures had discovered that air wasn't something to be tamed, but persuaded, as if they had learned to read a language not written on parchment, but in the invisible currents that run through the earth. Modern engineers confirm that this gentle flow creates an interior microclimate that is surprisingly stable, almost impossible to achieve in a surface-level structure. And you, listening to this, do you think two peoples so far apart could reach the same knowledge by chance? Or is there something deeper connecting those who dare to challenge winter? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the answer appears right where intuition meets history. For the Vikings, the cold could kill in hours, but there was a more treacherous enemy, one that made no sound, gave no warning, and could destroy an entire shelter with a single drop. Moisture. Underground, where heat builds slowly, water seeping up from the soil could rot the turf, swell the wood, and create a thick vapor that, mixed with the smoke from the hearth, became toxic. A silent poison capable of suffocating an entire family while they slept. That's why they observed the land like someone reading a prophecy. They looked for the frost that took longest to melt, the moss that never soaked through, the grass growing in strange lines, small signals that determined whether a house would survive the winter or collapse under the weight of ice. In Norway, many semi-buried dwellings were built on slopes of just 3 degrees, enough for meltwater to drain without flooding the home. In Iceland, layers of pumice stone beneath the floor absorbed moisture, as if they were breathing for the entire house. What's surprising isn't just their precision, but the twist that unsettles modern architects. While many houses today still struggle with mold and condensation, those 9th century structures controlled humidity with an efficiency we would now call sustainable. And maybe here comes the uncomfortable question. How did a civilization with no blueprints or sensors defeat an enemy that still challenges our modern homes? Inside the Viking shelter, when the night seemed endless and the wind roared over the fjords like a wounded animal, the fire wasn't just a source of heat, it was the boundary between life and chaos. Its trembling light turned shadows into figures that seemed to move with a memory of their own, and every crack of the wood was almost a prayer. The sagas say the fire was born from the breath of the gods, and as long as the clan breathed, it could not be allowed to die. That's why, before sleeping, a woman would stir the embers and cover them with ash so they would stay alive until dawn. What's most fascinating is that the placement of the hearth wasn't accidental. It was aligned with the wind, the entrance, the sun, as if the entire house orbited around a small domestic star. Around it, hierarchy was arranged. The leader in the east, the young in the west, the women at the center where the heart of the clan burned. Excavations in
Now the
Borg
king
and
wants
Bratalid
answers.
uncovered
And
burnt
answers you'll
offerings,
give him.
fragments of bone and amber. Evidence that the fire didn't just warm, it judged, united, and protected. And perhaps the most powerful truth is understanding that on those endless nights, the hearth wasn't an object. It was a spirit that breathed with them. The memory of the soil was the Vikings' true book, a living archive passed down through generations without a single written word. And yet the most unsettling part wasn't the absence of plans. It was the almost surgical precision with which they repeated their constructions. In the excavations at Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, archaeologists found patterns identical to those in Borg and Bratalid. Drainage channels with the same slope, turf walls woven at the same angle, ventilation tunnels aligned exactly to the south. When researchers calculated the tolerance required, they discovered something that completely shattered the romantic idea of ancestral intuition. An error of barely 10 centimeters in the direction of the tunnel could redirect smoke into the interior and suffocate an entire family during the night. It wasn't inspiration, it was extreme survival. That's why, when a shelter collapsed, they didn't just abandon it, they turned it into a school. Young people dug through the old foundations, analyzed layers of dry and wet soil, read the thermal history as if it were a forensic report, discovering where the wind had entered, where moisture had won, where heat had survived. That process wasn't learning, it was initiation. And here comes the silent political flex. While modern societies depend on blueprints, sensors, and building codes, the Vikings were replicating natural climate control systems with an accuracy that still surprises engineers today. When winter finally retreats and light begins to slide again over the turf-covered hills, a truth emerges that's more uncomfortable than we like to admit. The most extraordinary thing about Viking shelters wasn't what they built, but what they left beneath the ground. For centuries, we believed progress meant producing more heat, inventing increasingly complex machines to fight the cold, and yet those semi-buried homes made of grass, stone, and clay managed to retain up to 90% more energy than many modern houses in polar regions. The twist comes when engineers compare the data. A $20,000 HVAC system can lose heat within hours if the power fails, while a buried Viking house maintains its temperature thanks to the thermal pulse of the earth. A mechanism modern science took 1,000 years to reformulate. It's not that they were magical, it's that we forgot to listen. The earth absorbs summer heat, stores it beneath layers of moss and rock, and gives it back in winter like a deep breath. The Vikings and indigenous peoples discovered this without equations, only with patience and skin. And maybe this is where the question that divides opinions begins. Are we truly more advanced? Or did we simply walk away from knowledge that worked? Ancient shelters worked because they synchronized with the planet, not because they tried to dominate it.
It's a harsh winter.
If this idea provokes you, comment which system you think would survive a winter without technology. A modern house or a 9th century turf home. And if you want to join us for more journeys into this past that still breathes beneath our feet, subscribe. The Earth still has much to say.